I thought I was going to die right there at my own Thanksgiving table when my son's fiancée pointed her finger at me and screamed those words that shattered my world in front of my entire family. 25 years of building what I believed was the perfect life, 25 years of loving my son Michael with every fiber of my being, 25 years of keeping a secret I thought I'd take to my grave, all came crashing down in that one devastating moment. But what happened next was something none of us could have ever imagined, something so shocking that it would either destroy our family forever or create something even more beautiful than what we had before. My name is Sarah, I'm 52 years old, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, where the houses have white picket fences and everyone knows everyone else's business. Or at least they think they do. For over 2 decades, I've been the perfect wife to Richard, the perfect mother to Michael, and the perfect neighbor who bakes apple pies for church fundraisers and organizes block parties. But perfection, I've learned, is just another word for a beautifully crafted lie. It all started when I was 17 years old, living in a tiny town called Millerville, Alabama, where the population was barely 3,000 people and everyone went to the same Baptist church on Sundays. It was 1989 and I was a senior in high school with dreams of going to college, maybe becoming a teacher, finding love, getting married, having children the right way. But life has a cruel sense of humor. And sometimes it takes everything you think you know about yourself and turns it upside down in ways you never saw coming. I fell in love with Tommy Henderson, the quarterback of our high school football team, with blonde hair and blue eyes that made every girl in town weak in the knees. We'd been dating for 2 years and I genuinely believed we'd get married right after graduation, live in a little house near his parents' farm, and raise beautiful children together. We were careful, or so we thought, but one night after homecoming, passion got the better of us, and 3 weeks later I was staring at a positive pregnancy test in the bathroom of a gas station 20 miles outside of town, crying so hard I could barely breathe. When I told Tommy, his face went completely white, and he stammered something about being too young, about college scholarships, about how his parents would kill him. Within a week, he'd broken up with me and started dating Jennifer Mills, the preacher's daughter. I was left alone, 17, pregnant, and living with parents who believed that pregnancy outside of marriage was the ultimate sin, a shame that would follow our family for generations. My father, a stern man who worked at the local sawmill and read the Bible every night after dinner, didn't speak to me for 2 weeks after I told them. My mother, a fragile woman who taught Sunday school and never missed a church service, cried every day and kept asking where she went wrong as a parent. The shame in our house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They took me out of school, telling everyone I had mono and would finish my senior year with a tutor. But there was no tutor. There was just me, growing bigger every day, feeling more isolated and terrified than I ever thought possible. They found a Christian adoption agency in Montgomery, 2 hours away from our town. The social worker was a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson who assured my parents that this was God's plan, that there was a wonderful Christian family desperately wanting a baby, and that giving the child up for adoption would be the most loving thing I could do. She promised that after the birth I would never see or hear about the child again, that I could move on with my life as if none of this had ever happened. At 17, scared and alone, it seemed like the only option that made sense. I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy on a snowy February morning in 1990. He had dark hair, just like mine, and when they placed him in my arms for those precious few minutes before they took him away forever, he looked at me with these deep brown eyes that seemed to see right into my soul. I named him David, though I knew his adoptive parents would probably change it. I held him for exactly 15 minutes, memorized every tiny detail of his perfect face, whispered that I loved him and that I was sorry, and then I handed him to Mrs. Patterson and watched her walk out of the room with my heart. 3 months later I was back in school, pretending to be the same Sarah I'd always been. But inside I was completely hollow. Everyone bought the mono story, and life went on as if nothing had happened. I graduated, got a partial scholarship to Ohio State University, and moved to Columbus to start over. My parents were relieved to have me gone, and I was grateful to be in a place where no one knew my story. College was supposed to be a fresh start, but I carried the weight of that secret everywhere I went. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in elementary education, determined to make something of my life. I avoided serious relationships for 2 years, too scared to get close to anyone, too afraid that I'd mess up again. But during my junior year I met Richard in a sociology class, and he was different from any guy I'd ever known. Richard was from a small town in northern Ohio, studying business administration with plans to take over his family's hardware store. He was steady, reliable, kind, and patient. He had gentle hazel eyes and a way of listening that made me feel like the most important person in the world. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed, and when he did, it was simple and perfect, just him and me on the steps of the library where we'd first really talked. I said yes, but I never told him about the baby. How do you tell someone you love that you've given away a child? How do you explain that there's a piece of your heart walking around somewhere in the world with strangers? I told myself that it was in the past, that it didn't matter anymore, that starting fresh meant leaving everything behind. We got married in a small ceremony in Columbus in 1993, and I moved to the suburbs with him, ready to build the life I'd always dreamed of. For the first 3 years of our marriage, we tried to have children. Month after month, my period would come, and I'd lock myself in the bathroom and cry, wondering if giving away my first child had somehow cursed me never to have another. Richard was patient and loving, suggesting fertility tests, different doctors even considering fertility treatments. But deep inside, I wondered if this was God's way of punishing me for what I'd done. Then in 1996, our caseworker from the adoption agency called us. There was a 6-month-old baby boy whose adoption had fallen through at the last minute. The original adoptive parents had gone through a messy divorce, and the baby needed a new home immediately. Would we be interested in meeting him? The moment I saw Michael, something clicked into place in my heart. He was 6 months old with the same dark hair I'd had as a baby, and when he looked at me with those deep brown eyes, I felt a connection so strong it took my breath away. Richard fell in love with him instantly too, and within 2 weeks, Michael was officially our son. I threw myself into motherhood with an intensity that surprised even me. Every milestone, every first word, every scraped knee, every bedtime story became precious beyond measure. I was determined to be the mother Michael deserved, to give him all the love I hadn't been able to give to the baby I'd lost. Richard often joked that I loved Michael so much it was almost fierce, and he was right. My love for my son was desperate and all-consuming because I knew what it felt like to lose a child. Michael grew up to be an incredible young man. He was smart, funny, compassionate, and had inherited both Richard's steady nature and what I thought was my determination. He played baseball in high school, got good grades, went to Ohio State like I had, and majored in engineering. He was everything I'd ever dreamed a son could be, and watching him grow up was the greatest joy of my life. When Michael turned 24 and started talking about marriage, I was thrilled for him. He'd been dating Jessica for 2 years, and she seemed like a lovely girl. She was 23, worked as a freelance genealogist, and had a passion for family history that I found charming. Though it sometimes made me a little nervous when she talked about tracing family trees and discovering hidden stories. Jessica had been adopted as a baby too, which created an immediate bond between her and Michael. They understood each other in ways that other people couldn't, sharing stories about wondering about their birth parents and feeling grateful for the families who raised them. It was beautiful to watch, and I was genuinely excited about welcoming her into our family. The engagement was perfect. Michael proposed at the same library where Richard had proposed to me, and Jessica said yes with tears streaming down her face. They started planning their wedding for the following spring, and I threw myself into helping with all the preparations. We looked at venues, tasted cakes, talked about flowers, and I felt like the luckiest mother in the world. But then Jessica started her genealogy project. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I'd love to know what you think so far. Drop the word secrets in the comments if you think Sarah should have told Michael the truth from the beginning. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because what happens next will completely blow your mind. It started innocently enough. Jessica had decided that for Thanksgiving, she wanted to create a family tree for both sides of their future family as a surprise gift. She was incredibly thorough, spending weeks researching birth certificates, marriage licenses, immigration records, and even doing DNA tests through one of those popular genealogy websites. She was so excited about the project, showing up at family dinners with folders full of documents and stories about distant relatives we'd never heard of. I watched her work with a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. Every time she mentioned finding birth records or adoption paperwork, my stomach would clench. But I told myself I was being paranoid. Michael's adoption had been handled through a completely different agency in a different state. There was no way Jessica's research could connect to my past. But Jessica was more thorough than I'd given her credit for. She started with Michael's adoption records, which were mostly sealed, but she managed to find some basic information through public records and the DNA database. She discovered that Michael had been born in Alabama, which was something we'd never told him because honestly, we'd never thought it mattered where he was born before he became our son. Then she started researching her own background more deeply. Jessica had always known she was adopted, and her adoptive parents had been open about it, but they'd never had much information about her birth family. Using the same technique she'd used for Michael, she submitted her DNA to multiple databases and started finding matches. What she discovered changed everything. According to the DNA results, Jessica had a close familial match with someone in the database. Not just any match, but someone who shared enough genetic markers to be either a parent or a sibling. When she traced the connection further, she realized that the match was connected to Michael's profile, which she'd helped him set up months earlier. First, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe there was an error in the database, or maybe they were distant cousins or something. But the more she researched, the more pieces started falling into place in ways that made her sick to her stomach. Both Michael and Jessica had been born in Alabama. Both had been placed for adoption through Christian agencies. Both had been born to young, unmarried mothers. And both had birth dates that suggested they could be siblings, with Michael being born in February 1990 and Jessica in August 1991. Jessica spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the evidence, trying to convince herself that it was all a horrible coincidence. But when she finally got the courage to call the adoption agency that had handled her placement, the social worker confirmed what she already suspected. Jessica and Michael were indeed biological siblings, both children of the same 17-year-old girl who had given them up for adoption 17 months apart. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The social worker, who was bound by confidentiality laws, but felt that Jessica had a right to know, revealed something that made Jessica's world explode. The woman who had given birth to both children had been contacted by an adoption agency 6 years later about adopting a child whose placement had fallen through. That woman had said yes, and the child she adopted was Michael, which meant that Sarah Collins, the woman Jessica was about to call Mom after the wedding, was actually her biological mother. The mother who had given her away and then kept her brother. Jessica confronted me 3 days before Thanksgiving. She showed up at my door on a Monday afternoon while Richard was at work and Michael was at his job at the engineering firm downtown. She had a manila folder in her hands and a look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Something between devastation and rage. "We need to talk," she said. And I knew immediately that my carefully constructed world was about to fall apart. She spread the documents across my kitchen table methodically, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. DNA results, birth certificates, adoption records, family trees with lines connecting Michael to me to her. She'd done her homework, and there was no denying what she'd discovered. "You're my mother," she said quietly. "You gave me away in August 1991, and then 6 years later you adopted Michael, who is my biological brother. Did you know? When you adopted him, did you know he was your own son?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. For 25 years, I had managed to compartmentalize the 2 biggest secrets of my life, never imagining they could be connected. I had no idea that the baby I'd adopted was the same child I'd given birth to 6 years earlier. I had no idea that the young woman my son was about to marry was the daughter I'd held for 15 minutes, and then given away forever. The room was spinning. Jessica was crying. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of my perfect life cracking apart like ice on a frozen lake. "I don't understand," I whispered. "They promised me I'd never know what happened to you. They promised me anonymity. They promised me that you'd go to a good family, and that would be the end of it. Did you know?" she asked again, more forcefully this time. "When you adopted Michael, did you know he was your biological son?" "No," I said, and it was the truth. "I swear to God, Jessica, I had no idea. If I had known, I never would have let you and Michael get engaged. I never would have let this happen." She stared at me for a long time, studying my face like she was trying to decide whether to believe me. "So you gave away 2 children and then accidentally adopted one of them back?" "I gave away 2 children because I was 17 years old, unmarried, and had no other choice," I said, my voice getting stronger. "I gave away 2 children because my parents and my church and my community told me it was the right thing to do. I gave away 2 children because I thought I was giving them a better life than I could provide. But you kept Michael. I didn't keep Michael. Richard and I adopted Michael when he was 6 months old because his first adoption fell through. I didn't know he was my biological son. I loved him from the moment I saw him, but I thought it was just the connection any mother feels with her child. Jessica was quiet for a long time, looking at the documents spread between us like pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense no matter how you arranged them. "What about me?" she finally asked. "Did you ever think about me? Did you ever wonder what happened to the daughter you gave away?" My heart broke completely. "Every single day," I whispered. "Not a day has gone by in 24 years that I haven't thought about you. Wondered if you were happy, wondered if your parents loved you, wondering if I made the right choice. You and your brother were the first thing I thought about every morning and the last thing I thought about every night. My brother who you kept. My son who I didn't know was my biological child until you just told me." We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, Jessica started gathering up the documents. "I can't marry Michael," she said matter-of-factly. "Obviously, I can't marry my own brother. But I also can't pretend I don't know what I know now. This family, this perfect little suburban life you've built, it's all based on lies. It's based on love," I said desperately. "Yes, there were secrets, but everything I did was out of love. I loved you enough to give you what I thought would be a better life. I loved Michael enough to give him the best life I could provide. I love Richard enough to protect him from pain he didn't need to carry. This family is built on love, Jessica. Complicated, messy, imperfect love, but love nonetheless." She stopped at the door and turned back to look at me. "Are you going to tell them or am I?" "I need some time," I said. "Please, just give me some time to figure out how to explain something. I don't even understand myself." "You have until Thanksgiving dinner," she said. "If you don't tell them by then, I will." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in my kitchen with the shattered remains of every secret I'd ever kept. The 3 days between Jessica's revelation and Thanksgiving dinner were the longest of my life. I barely slept, I couldn't eat, and I jumped every time the phone rang, terrified that it would be Michael asking why his fiancée was acting so strange. Richard noticed something was wrong, of course. After 27 years of marriage, he could read my moods better than anyone. But when he asked what was bothering me, I just told him I was stressed about hosting Thanksgiving for both families. He accepted that explanation, probably because he was dealing with his own stress about having his brother's family and Jessica's adoptive parents over for the first time. I spent those 3 days practicing different ways to tell the truth. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and tried out various approaches. The gentle approach, the direct approach, the approach where I started with the story of my teenage pregnancy, the approach where I started with Michael's adoption. But no matter how I phrased it, it sounded insane. It sounded like something out of a soap opera. Too ridiculous to be real. How do you tell your husband that you've been keeping a secret about giving birth to 2 children when you were a teenager? How do you tell your son that not only is he adopted, but he's about to marry his biological sister? How do you explain that you had no idea about the connection until 3 days ago? How do you make anyone believe that this level of cosmic coincidence is even possible? By Wednesday night, I still hadn't found the words. I lay in bed next to Richard, listening to him breathe, wondering if this would be the last night we'd ever sleep peacefully side by side. Because once I told him the truth, everything would change. Our marriage, our family, our entire life would be different. There would be no going back to the way things were before. On Thanksgiving morning, I got up at 5 o'clock and started cooking, hoping that staying busy would calm my nerves. I made Richard's favorite stuffing recipe, Michael's favorite green bean casserole, Jessica's favorite sweet potato pie. I set the dining room table with our good china and the candlesticks that had belonged to my grandmother. I arranged flowers from our garden in the centerpiece and made sure everything was perfect, as if having the perfect Thanksgiving dinner could somehow make the imperfect truth easier to swallow. The guests started arriving around noon. Richard's brother Tom came with his wife Linda and their twin teenage daughters. Jessica's adoptive parents, Bob and Mary Patterson, brought wine and homemade cranberry sauce. Michael arrived with Jessica, and I watched carefully as she gave me a polite hug and asked if there was anything she could help with in the kitchen. She looked pale and tired, like she hadn't been sleeping any better than I had. But she was pleasant to everyone, chatting with the other guests and helping carry dishes to the table. If I hadn't known what was coming, I would have thought she was just nervous about meeting Richard's side of the family for the first time. We gathered around the table at 2 o'clock, just as we had every Thanksgiving for the past 20 years. Richard sat at the head of the table with me at the other end. Michael and Jessica sat next to each other on one side, with her parents beside them. Tom's family filled out the other side. Everyone was laughing and talking, complimenting the food, sharing stories about their week. Richard stood up to say the blessing, as he always did. He thanked God for our family, for our health, for our many blessings. He thanked God for bringing Jessica into our family, and for the joy she'd brought to Michael's life. He asked for blessings on their upcoming marriage, and for many years of happiness together. I kept my eyes closed during the prayer, but I could feel Jessica looking at me. When Richard finished and everyone said amen, I opened my eyes and met her gaze across the table. She gave me a small nod as if to say, "Last chance." But I still couldn't find the words. The conversation continued around me, but I felt like I was underwater, hearing everything through a thick layer of fear and guilt. Someone complimented the turkey. Someone else asked about Michael's job. Mary Patterson told a story about Jessica's childhood that made everyone laugh. And then Jessica stood up. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the conversation like a knife, "before we go any further, there's something I need to say." The table went quiet. Richard looked at her with mild curiosity. Michael reached for her hand, probably thinking she was going to make some kind of romantic toast about their engagement. "I've been doing a lot of genealogy research lately," Jessica said, her voice unnaturally calm, "working on family trees for both sides of our family. And I've discovered some things that I think everyone needs to know." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "Jessica," I said quietly, "maybe we should." "No," she said firmly. "We shouldn't. We should have done this a long time ago." She pulled out the manila folder she'd brought with her, and placed it on the table next to the cranberry sauce. "Michael," she said, turning to look at him, "did you know you were adopted?" The question hit the table like a bomb. Michael's face went completely white. Richard dropped his fork. Bob and Mary Patterson looked confused. Tom's family stopped eating and stared. "What are you talking about?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were born in Montgomery, Alabama in February 1990, Jessica continued in that same unnaturally calm voice. "You were placed for adoption through a Christian agency, and adopted by Richard and Sarah when you were 6 months old." Richard turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Sarah," he said. "What is she talking about?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "That's not all," Jessica said, her voice getting louder and more strained. "I was also born in Alabama. I was also placed for adoption through a Christian agency. And according to DNA testing, Michael and I are biological siblings." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael was staring at Jessica like she'd just spoken in a foreign language. Richard was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Everyone else was looking back and forth between us, trying to process what they just heard. "But that's not even the most shocking part," Jessica continued, and now her voice was shaking with emotion. "The most shocking part is that our biological mother is sitting right here at this table." She pointed directly at me, her hand trembling with rage and pain. "That woman's not your real mother, Michael," she screamed, her composure finally cracking. "She's mine. She gave me away when I was born and then adopted you 6 years later without even knowing you were her son too." The explosion that followed was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It was as if someone had thrown a grenade into the middle of our perfect Thanksgiving dinner and watched everything we'd built together disintegrate in real time. Michael pushed back from the table so hard his chair fell over. "What?" he kept saying over and over. "What? What are you talking about?" Richard stood up slowly, his face cycling through confusion, shock, betrayal, and something that looked like grief. "Sarah," he said in a voice I'd never heard before, "tell me she's lying." But I couldn't tell him she was lying because she wasn't. Jessica's adoptive parents were trying to calm her down, but she was crying and yelling at the same time. 24 years of abandonment and pain pouring out of her in a torrent of words I could barely understand. Tom's family was just sitting there in stunned silence, probably wishing they'd never agreed to come to dinner. And I was frozen in my chair, watching my entire life implode while the turkey got cold and the candles burned down. Is it true? Michael demanded, turning to face me directly. Am I adopted? Are you not my real mother? You are my real son, I said, finally finding my voice. You have been my son for 25 years, and nothing will ever change that. But did you give birth to me? No, I whispered. I didn't give birth to you. But I chose you. I loved you. I raised you. And Jessica? Richard asked. Did you give birth to her? The room was spinning again. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for an answer that would either make things better or make them infinitely worse. Yes, I said, so quietly I wasn't sure anyone could hear me. What? Michael said. Yes, I said louder, standing up from my chair. Yes, I gave birth to Jessica. And yes, I gave birth to your biological brother too, but I didn't know it was you when we adopted you. I didn't know any of this until Jessica told me 3 days ago. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Richard sat back down heavily, like all the strength had gone out of his legs. You had children before we met, he said. It wasn't a question. I had children when I was 17 years old, I said, the words pouring out of me now like water through a broken dam. I was unmarried, living with religious parents in a tiny town in Alabama where being pregnant and unmarried was the worst thing that could happen to a girl. I gave away 2 babies because I thought it was the right thing to do, because everyone told me it was the right thing to do, because I was 17 and scared and alone and I didn't know what else to do. 2 babies? Michael asked. You and Jessica. 17 months apart. I gave you both to Christian adoption agencies because I thought you'd have better lives with families who could provide for you properly. But then you adopted me back, Michael said, trying to work it out in his head. I adopted a 6-month-old baby whose adoption had fallen through, I corrected. I had no idea that baby was my biological son. The agencies promised complete anonymity. They promised I'd never know what happened to either of you. They promised you'd go to good families and that would be the end of it. Jessica had stopped crying and was now staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. So when you saw Michael for the first time you didn't recognize him? She asked. I felt a connection, I said honestly. But I thought it was just the connection any mother feels when she meets her child for the first time. I thought it was love at first sight the way it's supposed to be. I never imagined it was because I'd held him before, when he was 15 minutes old, before I gave him away. 15 minutes? Michael asked. That's how long they let me hold you after you were born. 15 minutes to memorize your face before they took you away forever. Michael sat back down but he wouldn't look at me. And you never told Dad any of this? How could I tell him? I asked, looking at Richard, who was staring at his hands. How do you tell someone you love that you've given away children? How do you explain something you don't even understand yourself? By being honest, Richard said quietly. By trusting me enough to tell me the truth. I was afraid you wouldn't love me anymore, I admitted. I was afraid you'd think I was damaged goods, that you'd leave me like everyone else had left me. So instead you lied to me for 27 years. I didn't lie about anything that mattered, I said desperately. I didn't lie about loving you or loving Michael or wanting to build a life with you. Those were the truest things I've ever said. Jessica was looking back and forth between Michael and me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Do you see the resemblance now? She asked Michael. Now that you know? Michael finally looked up at me, really looked at me, and I could see him studying my face, looking for similarities he'd never noticed before. The eyes, he said slowly. We have the same eyes. And the same stubborn streak, Richard added with bitter humor. This is insane, Tom said, speaking up for the first time since the revelations began. This is absolutely insane. You think? Jessica said sarcastically. I've been planning to marry my own brother. My biological mother has been playing house with the son she gave away while I grew up wondering why my real mother didn't want me. And none of us knew any of this until I accidentally discovered it doing a family tree. I did want you, I said, looking directly at Jessica. I wanted you so much it nearly killed me to let you go. Both of you. But you let us go anyway. I was 17, Jessica. I was a child myself. I made the best decision I could with the information and support I had at the time. And when you adopted Michael back, you couldn't track me down too? I didn't know he was my biological son, I said, frustrated that no one seemed to understand this crucial point. I thought I was adopting a completely unrelated baby. If I had known he was mine, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you too. Would you? She asked. Or would you have been satisfied with getting one of your children back? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for the past 3 days. If I had known Michael was my biological son, would I have tried to find Jessica? Would I have told Richard the truth about my past? Would I have done anything differently? I don't know, I said honestly. I like to think I would have, but I don't know. I was so desperate to have a family, so desperate to put the past behind me. I might have convinced myself that one child was enough, that you were better off with your adoptive family. Jessica nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. Well, she said, standing up and throwing her napkin on the table, I guess we'll never know, will we? She turned to Michael. Obviously we can't get married. I'll return the ring tomorrow. Jessica, wait, Michael said, reaching for her hand. We can figure this out. We can get counseling, we can take some time, we can what, Michael? We can pretend we didn't just find out we're siblings? We can pretend your mother didn't abandon me while keeping you? We can pretend this is all just some crazy misunderstanding that we can work through with therapy. She's not my mother, Michael said quietly. Apparently she's yours. And with that, he stood up and walked out of the house, leaving his keys on the hall table and his entire life behind. Jessica looked at me one more time. I hope it was worth it, she said. I hope the 25 years you got with him were worth the lifetime you cost me. Then she was gone too, and I was left standing in my dining room surrounded by the ruins of our Thanksgiving dinner and the smoking wreckage of my family. Richard stayed in his chair for a long time after everyone else had either left or gone upstairs to the guest rooms. He just sat there, staring at the turkey that no one had finished eating, surrounded by dishes of food that had gone cold while our lives fell apart. 27 years, he finally said. 27 years, Sarah. I know. I shared everything with you. My hopes, my fears, my dreams, my family, my business, my bed. I trusted you with every part of my life. And I trusted you with every part of mine that mattered, I said. The part of me that loved you, the part of me that wanted to be your wife, the part of me that wanted to be Michael's mother. That was all real, Richard. That was all true. But you didn't trust me with the part of you that was broken. You didn't trust me with the part of you that was scared. You didn't trust me with the part of you that needed healing. He was right and we both knew it. I was afraid, I said simply. Of what? Of losing you. Of losing Michael. Of losing the life we'd built together. So instead you built it on lies. I built it on hope, I said. I built it on the hope that the past didn't have to define the future, that I could be the person I wanted to be instead of the person I used to be. Richard looked at me for a long time and I could see 27 years of marriage in his eyes. Our wedding day, bringing Michael home from the hospital, first steps and first words and first days of school, Christmas mornings and birthday parties and family vacations, quiet evenings on the couch and passionate nights in our bedroom, fights about money and make-up kisses, dreams we'd shared and goals we'd achieved together. I need some time, he said finally. I need to think about this. About us. About what happens now. He went upstairs to our bedroom, and I heard him packing a bag. 20 minutes later, he came back down with his suitcase and his laptop bag. I'm going to stay with Tom for a while, he said, until I figure out how to process all of this. Richard, please, I said. Don't leave me alone with this. We can work through it together. I can't work through anything right now, Sarah. I can't even look at you right now without wondering what else you haven't told me. And then he was gone too, and I was completely alone for the first time in 27 years. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. Richard stayed with his brother and communicated with me only through text messages about practical matters like bills and schedules. Michael moved out of his apartment and disappeared completely. He wouldn't answer my calls, wouldn't respond to my texts, and when I drove by his office, his coworkers told me he'd taken indefinite leave. Jessica blocked me on all social media and changed her phone number. I was completely alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter and love, surrounded by reminders of the family I'd lost through my own deception. Michael's high school baseball trophies still sat on the mantel. Richard's reading glasses were still on his nightstand. Jessica's engagement photos with Michael were still stuck to our refrigerator with magnets from our family vacations. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything. I called in sick to my job at the elementary school so many times that they finally suggested I take a leave of absence. I spent most of my days sitting in Michael's childhood bedroom, looking at photo albums and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The community reaction was swift and brutal. Word spread quickly through our suburban neighborhood about what had happened at the Collins Thanksgiving dinner. The story got more distorted with each telling. I was a teenage mother who had abandoned multiple children. I was a woman who had somehow orchestrated an elaborate scheme to reunite with my biological son while excluding my daughter. I was a pathological liar who had built my entire life on deception. People I'd known for 20 years crossed the street to avoid talking to me. Parents at Michael's old school whispered when they saw me at the grocery store. Even my pastor, a man who had counseled me through difficult times and celebrated our family's joys for over 2 decades, suggested that I might want to find a different church where I could start fresh. The isolation was crushing, but it also forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for 25 years. I started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, who specialized in adoption trauma and family secrets. For the first time in my adult life, I told someone the complete truth about everything. The teenage pregnancies, the pressure from my family and community, the years of infertility, the adoption that I now realized had been my own biological son, the decades of keeping secrets from the people I loved most. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that what had happened to me as a teenager was not my fault, that I had been a victim of a system and a culture that punished young women for normal human sexuality, while offering them impossible choices with lifelong consequences. She helped me see that my decision to keep quiet about my past had been driven by trauma and shame, not malice or selfishness. But understanding the psychology behind my choices didn't make the consequences any less devastating. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I decided that if my family was going to hate me anyway, they at least deserved to hate me for the right reasons. I wrote letters to Richard, Michael, and Jessica, telling them the complete story of what had happened to me as a teenager, explaining the social and cultural context that had led to my decisions, and taking full responsibility for the pain my secrets had caused them. I didn't ask for forgiveness because I wasn't sure I deserved it. I didn't ask them to come back because I wasn't sure they should. I just asked them to understand that every choice I had made, right or wrong, had been motivated by love. Love for them, love for our family, and a desperate desire to protect the beautiful life we had built together. I mailed the letters on a gray December morning and then waited. Richard was the first to respond. He called me 2 days later and asked if he could come over to talk. When he arrived at our house, he looked older than I'd ever seen him, like the stress of the past month had aged him years in just a few weeks. We sat in our living room, in the same chairs where we'd had thousands of conversations over the years, but everything felt different now. There was a distance between us that had never been there before, an awareness of how much we didn't know about each other despite nearly 3 decades of marriage. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said. "About us, about our marriage, about what trust means in a relationship." My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay quiet and let him talk. "I keep going back to that night in college when you told me you loved me for the first time," he continued. "We were walking back from the library, and it started to rain, and you stopped right in the middle of the sidewalk and said it like you couldn't hold it in for another second. I remembered that night perfectly. It was one of the most honest moments of my life. That was real," he said. "That love was real. The way you looked at me, the way your voice shook when you said it, the way you kissed me afterward, that was all real." "It was," I said quietly. "And when Michael took his first steps, right there in our kitchen, and you started crying because you were so happy, that was real too. Every moment of being his mother was real. And when we renewed our vows on our 20th anniversary, when you promised to love me for the rest of your life, that was real. The realest thing I've ever said." Richard was quiet for a long time, looking around the room at the photos on our walls, the furniture we'd picked out together, the life we'd built. "I've been angry," he said finally. "Angrier than I've ever been in my life. Not just because you lied to me, but because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. Because you thought so little of my love for you that you believed I'd leave you if I knew about your past. I was 17 when I got pregnant," I said. "Everyone I trusted left me. My boyfriend, my friends, even my parents emotionally abandoned me. I learned not to trust people with my deepest vulnerabilities because every time I did, I got hurt. But I'm not everyone else, Sarah. I'm your husband. I'm the man who promised to love you for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. Did you really think I'd break those vows because you'd made some difficult decisions as a teenager? The truth was, yes, I had thought that. Not because Richard was untrustworthy, but because my experience had taught me that love always came with conditions, that acceptance was always temporary, that eventually everyone would decide I was too damaged to be worth keeping. I was wrong, I said. I was wrong to not trust you, wrong to keep secrets, wrong to build our marriage on anything less than complete honesty. You were wrong, he agreed. But I'm beginning to understand why you were wrong. And I'm beginning to think that maybe wrong doesn't always mean unforgivable. We talked for hours that day, really talked in a way we hadn't done since we were dating. I told him everything about my childhood, my parents' religious extremism, the shame and isolation I'd felt as a pregnant teenager, the trauma of giving birth and immediately giving away 2 babies. He told me about his own fears and insecurities, about times in our marriage when he'd kept smaller secrets because he was afraid of disappointing me or changing how I saw him. By the end of the conversation, we weren't magically healed, but we were honest with each other for the first time in our entire relationship. And that honesty, painful as it was, felt like a foundation we could maybe build something new on. I want to try, Richard said as he was getting ready to leave. I want to try to rebuild this marriage on truth instead of secrets. But I need you to understand that it's going to take time, and it's going to require complete transparency from now on. No more secrets, no matter how big or small. No more secrets, I promised. And we're going to need counseling. Both of us, separately and together. Whatever it takes. He kissed my forehead before he left. The first physical affection he'd shown me since Thanksgiving. It wasn't passionate or romantic, but it was tender. And it gave me hope that maybe we could find our way back to each other. Michael took longer to respond to my letter. In fact, he didn't respond directly at all. Instead, he showed up at my door on a snowy evening in early January, looking thin and tired and older than his 25 years. "Can I come in?" he asked, and I almost started crying just from hearing his voice again. We sat in the kitchen where I'd made him thousands of meals over the years, where he'd done homework and told me about his day and brought girlfriends to meet me. But now we sat across from each other like strangers, unsure of how to navigate this new reality. "I've been staying with friends," he said, "trying to figure out who I am now that everything I thought I knew about myself has changed." "You're the same person you've always been," I said. "You're kind and intelligent and funny and compassionate. You're a talented engineer and a loyal friend and the best son anyone could ask for. None of that has changed." "But I'm not really your son, am I?" he asked. "I mean, biologically I am, but I'm not the son you chose to keep. I'm the son you gave away and then accidentally got back." "You are absolutely my son," I said firmly. "You became my son the moment I held you when you were 6 months old. And you've been my son every day since then. The fact that I gave birth to you doesn't make you less my son, it makes you more my son. You're the child of." It was a question that had been haunting me since Jessica's revelation. If I had loved my biological son enough to choose him as my adoptive son without even knowing the connection, what did that mean about my relationship with my biological daughter? "I think it means that some connections transcend what we understand about genetics and biology," I said slowly. "I think it means that even without knowing you were my biological son, my heart recognized you as mine. And I think it means that if I had met Jessica as a baby, I would have felt the same connection to her. But you didn't meet her as a baby. You met her as an adult, and you had no idea who she was." "No, I didn't," I admitted. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Not because I didn't recognize her, but because she grew up thinking her biological mother didn't want her when the truth is that I thought about her every single day." We talked until almost midnight, covering the same ground over and over as Michael tried to process the reality of his life story. He was angry, confused, hurt, and grieving for the simple narrative he'd lost. But underneath all of that, I could sense that he was also relieved to finally understand the fierce intensity of my love for him, to know that it had been rooted in something deeper than just maternal affection. "I need time," he said before he left. "I need to figure out how to be your son and Jessica's brother. and my own person all at the same time. But I don't want to lose you. Even with all the secrets and lies and confusion, I don't want to lose the mother who raised me. You'll never lose me, I promised. No matter how long you need, no matter how angry you get, no matter what happens with the rest of the family, you will never lose me. He hugged me before he left, and for just a moment, he felt like my little boy again. Jessica was the hardest to reach. She didn't respond to my letter at all, and when I tried to contact her adoptive parents, they told me politely but firmly that she needed space and time to process everything that had happened. I understood, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. Every day that passed without hearing from her was another day of wondering if I'd lost her forever. Another day of imagining her somewhere out there hating me for choices I'd made when I was barely older than she was now. Finally, in late February, almost 3 months after our disastrous Thanksgiving, Jessica called me. "I need to see you," she said without preamble. "There are things I need to say, questions I need answered." We met at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory where we could talk without the emotional weight of my house or the awkwardness of hers. She looked different than she had at Thanksgiving, more mature somehow, like the events of the past few months had forced her to grow up in ways she hadn't expected. "I've been in therapy," she said after we'd ordered our drinks, "trying to work through my feelings about everything that happened. How is that going?" "It's hard," she said honestly. "I've spent 24 years constructing an identity around being the daughter who was given away, the daughter who wasn't wanted. And now I have to rebuild that identity around the truth, which is much more complicated than I thought." "What do you mean?" "I mean that it's easier to hate someone who abandoned you because they didn't care than it is to understand someone who abandoned you because they thought it was best for you. It's easier to be angry at a selfish mother than it is to be angry at a 17-year-old girl who was doing what everyone told her was right." I waited for her to continue. "My therapist has been helping me understand the context of your situation," Jessica said. "The cultural pressures, the religious judgment, the complete lack of support for teenage mothers in the late 80s and early 90s. Intellectually, I can understand why you made the choices you made. But emotionally, I'm still that little girl who grew up wondering why her mother didn't love her enough to keep her. Emotionally, I'm still angry that you got to raise Michael while I grew up with strangers. Emotionally, I'm furious that you had 25 years with him while I got nothing." Her honesty was painful but also healing. At least she was talking to me, at least she was trying to work through her feelings instead of just cutting me out of her life completely. "I can't change the past," I said. "I can't give you back the childhood you should have had with me. And I can't take away the pain of growing up feeling abandoned. But I can tell you that giving you away was the hardest thing I've ever done, and not a day has passed that I haven't wondered about you and worried about you and wished things could have been different." "But they weren't different," Jessica said. "And now we have to figure out how to move forward from here." "Do you want to move forward?" I asked. "Do you want to have a relationship with me?" She was quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee and looking out the window at the February snow. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't know if I can be your daughter. I don't know if I can call you mom, or if I can pretend that we have a normal mother-daughter relationship when we miss 24 years of each other's lives. But I think I might want to try to be your friend. I think I might want to get to know the woman who gave birth to me, and see if we can build something new together." It wasn't the reconciliation I'd hoped for, but it was more than I'd dared to expect. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like to get to know you too, not as the baby I gave away, but as the woman you've become." We started slowly, meeting for coffee every few weeks, sharing stories about our lives, trying to find common ground. She told me about her adoptive parents, who had loved her deeply and given her every opportunity to succeed. I told her about my marriage to Richard, about the joy of raising Michael, about the career I'd built teaching elementary school. Gradually, we discovered that we had more in common than either of us had expected. We both loved old movies and chocolate chip cookies and rainy Sunday afternoons. We both cried at commercials and kept journals and had strong opinions about politics. We both had the same laugh and the same tendency to bite our bottom lip when we were nervous. Most importantly, we both loved Michael, and that shared love became the bridge that connected us. Michael, meanwhile, had been working through his own complicated feelings about our family situation. He'd moved back to his apartment but was coming to dinner at our house once a week, slowly rebuilding his relationship with both Richard and me. He'd also reached out to Jessica, and they were trying to navigate the strange territory of being siblings instead of fiancé and fiancée. It's weird, he told me one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. She's exactly the kind of person I would have wanted for a sister, if I'd grown up knowing I had a sister. She's smart and funny and she challenges me in all the right ways. But we have all this romantic history that makes everything awkward. Are you both okay with that? We're getting there. We're both in therapy separately and together trying to figure out how to be family instead of lovers. It helps that we never actually, we were waiting until after the wedding. I was grateful for that small mercy. At least they wouldn't have to carry the additional trauma of physical intimacy with the knowledge that they were siblings. Do you think you'll both be okay? I asked. I think so, Michael said. It's going to take time, but I think we're going to be okay. We're talking about maybe going on a trip together this summer, just as siblings, to try to create new memories that aren't romantic. The healing process was slow and sometimes painful for all of us. There were setbacks and arguments and days when it felt like we'd never be able to function as a family again. But there were also breakthroughs and moments of unexpected joy, and the gradual recognition that we loved each other enough to do the hard work of rebuilding. Richard and I started couples counseling, and through months of difficult conversations, we began to construct a new marriage based on complete honesty and mutual respect. It was different from our old marriage, less idealistic but more real, less perfect but more authentic. Jessica and I continued our weekly coffee dates, slowly building a relationship that was part friendship, part mentorship, part delayed mother-daughter bonding. She started calling me Sarah instead of Mrs. Collins, which felt like progress. Michael resumed his role as the bridge between all of us, the person who could talk to Jessica when she was angry with me, who could reassure Richard when he was struggling with trust issues, who could remind me that love was stronger than secrets. And slowly, very slowly, we started to become a family again. Not the same family we'd been before, but a new family, one built on truth instead of secrets, on choice instead of biology, on forgiveness instead of perfection. The real test came the following Thanksgiving. We'd spent the entire year working toward being able to sit around the same table again, to share a meal without explosive revelations and devastating secrets. But we were all nervous about whether we'd actually be able to do it. Jessica surprised us all by volunteering to host the dinner at her apartment. I think it's time for me to take control of this holiday, she said, to make new memories that aren't connected to last year's disaster. The guest list was smaller this time. Just Richard, Michael, Jessica, and me. Bob and Mary Patterson were spending Thanksgiving with their other daughter in California. Tom's family had decided to stick with their own quiet celebration after the trauma of the previous year. But as we sat around Jessica's small dining room table, sharing food and stories and tentative laughter, I realized that smaller might actually be better. This felt more intimate, more honest, more real than all the elaborate Thanksgivings I'd hosted in my perfect suburban dining room. I have something I want to say, Jessica announced as we were finishing the main course. My heart stopped, remembering the last time she'd made an announcement at a Thanksgiving dinner. I want to thank you all for doing the hard work this year, she continued. For not giving up on our family, even when it would have been easier to walk away. For choosing to build something new instead of just mourning what we lost. She turned to look directly at me. And I want to thank you, Sarah, for giving me the gift of this family, even in the most unconventional way possible. For giving birth to the brother I never knew I wanted. For raising him to be the kind of man I'm proud to call family. And for showing me that love can survive even the most impossible circumstances. I started crying. Not the devastated tears of the previous Thanksgiving, but tears of gratitude and relief and overwhelming love. I also want to say, Jessica continued, that I've decided I want to legally change my last name to Collins. Not to replace my adoptive family, but to acknowledge this family too. To be Jessica Patterson Collins, daughter of two families, sister to Michael, friend to Sarah. Part of something bigger than any of us alone. Michael reached across the table and took her hand. Richard reached for mine. And for the first time in almost a year we felt like a complete family. There's one more thing, Jessica said, looking slightly nervous. I've met someone. His name is David, he's a teacher. And he makes me laugh in ways I didn't think were possible after everything that happened. I'd like you all to meet him soon. David. I said, smiling through my tears. That was the name I gave Michael when he was born, before I gave him away. I know, Jessica said. Michael told me. It's not a coincidence. David is adopted too, and when I told him our story, he said it felt like the universe was trying to tell us something about second chances and new beginnings. As we cleaned up after dinner, working together in Jessica's kitchen like we'd been doing it for years instead of months, I marveled at how different this Thanksgiving felt from the previous one. A year ago, we'd been a family held together by secrets and lies. Now we were a family held together by choice and forgiveness, and the radical decision to love each other despite our imperfections. What are you thinking about? Richard asked, finding me standing alone on Jessica's balcony, looking out at the city lights. I'm thinking about how grateful I am, I said, for Jessica's courage to tell the truth, even when it was painful, for Michael's willingness to forgive me, for your decision to fight for our marriage instead of walking away, for the chance to build something real instead of something perfect. It wasn't perfect before, was it? Richard said. We just pretended it was. No, it wasn't perfect, but it was good. And now it has the chance to be both good and true. Richard put his arm around me, and we stood together watching the world below us. Two people who had learned that love isn't about never making mistakes, but about making the choice to keep loving despite the mistakes. Do you think we'll be okay? I asked. I think we'll be better than okay, Richard said. I think we'll be real. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to know that it's been 2 years since that first devastating Thanksgiving, and we are more than okay. We are a family in the truest sense of the word. Not because we share the same DNA or the same last name or the same perfect suburban house, but because we've chosen each other again and again, through the hardest conversations and the most painful truths and the longest process of forgiveness. Michael and Jessica have become incredibly close siblings, supporting each other through career changes and relationship milestones, and the ongoing process of understanding their unique story. Jessica married David last spring in a ceremony where I had the honor of walking her down the aisle alongside her adoptive father. Michael is the best man, and in his speech, he talked about how sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that are built rather than born. Richard and I renewed our vows on our 30th wedding anniversary, promising this time to love each other with complete honesty and radical acceptance. Our marriage is stronger now than it ever was when it was based on the illusion of perfection. And I've learned that secrets don't protect the people we love, they isolate us from them. That truth, no matter how painful, is always better than lies, no matter how well-intentioned. That forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened, but about choosing love despite what happened. Most importantly, I've learned that family isn't about blood or biology or legal documents. Family is about showing up for each other, again and again, through the most impossible circumstances and the most devastating revelations and the longest journeys back to love. If you've made it to the end of this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think families can survive secrets like ours? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone and telling them the truth? Do you believe that love can overcome even the most complicated circumstances? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the beautiful messiness of real families. And remember that no matter how broken your family might seem, there's always hope for healing if you're willing to choose love over perfection, truth over secrets, and forgiveness over anger. Because sometimes the most incredible families are the ones that are rebuilt from the ground up, stronger and more beautiful than they ever were when they were held together by lies.